Yep.
Cool. All right. So my name is Alex, and my project was mostly centered around Arctic geopolitics. So the Arctic and all of its actors, Canada, Denmark via Greenland, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Russia, Sweden, and the United States via Alaska, have always lingered on the periphery of policymakers' agendas. And perhaps that's because the region has been long characterized by peace and cooperation that's irrespective of other geopolitical tensions abroad. And these ideals have been encapsulated in the term Arctic exceptionalism. However, recent shifts in global geopolitics and the climate have marked the conclusion of that era, thrusting the Arctic into the spotlight and underscoring the urgency to reassess and update the US's lacking Arctic strategy. So in my research, I proposed a nuanced two-pronged approach towards the Arctic. I argued that the US should cultivate a credible Arctic military posture calibrated to deter threats without escalating tensions, but concurrently, the US should emphasize scientific diplomacy to ease tensions and foster cooperation and ultimately revive Arctic exceptionalism. But first, let's answer the question, why are we talking about the Arctic in the first place? Well, put simply, there are two developing situations that have thrust the region into the spotlight. The first is climate change. Climate change has ravaged the Arctic. Indeed, summer sea ice has declined by 30% in the past 30 years, and 90% of old ice, which is 5 years old or more, has disappeared. In fact, the Arctic is now warming 3 times faster than the global average, leading scientists to project an Arctic free from summer ice by 2040 to 2045. Now, not only does this pose environmental concerns, it poses a geopolitical one, as previously inaccessible economic opportunities have been revealed. There are estimated to be up to 90 billion barrels of oil, 1,669 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, and 44 billion barrels of liquid natural gas in the Arctic, translating to roughly 22% of the undiscovered, technically recoverable fossil fuel resources in the world, which is the geographically largest unexplored prospective area for petroleum remaining on Earth. So especially for oil and natural gas dependent nations like Russia, securing these natural resources is essentially a matter of survival. In fact, for Russia, the Arctic already accounts for more than 20% of its GDP, 75% of its oil, and 95% of its natural gas reserves. And other critical resources in the Arctic are things like rare earth minerals, an estimated $1 trillion worth of these minerals essential for our most advanced technologies lie in the Arctic. However, the real money probably lies in the opening of trade routes. Indeed, Arctic trade routes allow countries to go up and over the globe, cutting transit times by an estimated 40%, and are so efficient that some scientists say that once they're clear of ice, they'll hold some 90% of global shipping. So with such attractive economic opportunities opening up because of climate change, countries like Russia who depend on those seek to use all the opportunities they have and begun engaging in aggression and militarization. But it's not only newfound economic opportunities driving Russian aggression. Indeed, climate change has also opened borders. Russia's icy northern coast, which is 53% of the Arctic coastline, has melted, becoming exposed, driving a new need to secure their border. And especially as the war in Ukraine accelerates fears of NATO encirclement, Russian expansion in the Arctic aims to secure its borders from an Arctic made up of all NATO members. And speaking of this war in Ukraine, that has been the other key driver in the evolving Arctic landscape. Indeed, there's been a twofold effect. First, as Russia stumbles in Ukraine and Putin faces hits to his popularity, Russia will seek to save face by engaging in brinkmanship in the Arctic. This diversionary sabotage has been commonly employed by Russia in various regions throughout history and on anything from oil pipelines or internet cables, which is also housed in the Arctic. But second, Russia's war in Ukraine provoked international condemnation from the West. And as a result, all of the Arctic nations have severed ties and cooperation with Russia via the Arctic Council. And the Arctic Council is the intergovernmental organization that houses Arctic cooperation. And now it's essentially collapsed, marking the first time geopolitical tensions have affected Arctic cooperation. So that era of peace and cooperation and Arctic exceptionalism is over, given this climate change and the war in Ukraine. Its future appears to be dominated by Russian aggression and militarization. So what does that look like right now? So militarily, Russia holds a commanding lead, boasting a network of Arctic bases that dwarfs NATO's and the US's by a third, along with a dedicated Arctic brigade and specialized icebreakers. leaving the West lagging behind with limited capabilities and aging infrastructure. Estimates suggest that it would take the West at least a decade to bridge this gap. Moreover, because of the significant absence of the West, Russia likely feels emboldened as there isn't any opposition standing in their way. And already, Russia has sent drones over Norway, has been jamming signals, and has cut Norwegian fiber optic cables. Further, Russian vessels are being deployed with tactical nuclear weapons on board for the first time since the end of the Cold War. But beyond the military sphere, Russia also dominates the economic arena. With vast resources at stake, Russia has poured resources into Arctic infrastructure, including ports, energy projects, and transportation networks. This strategic investment significantly surpasses that of other nations, solidifying Russia's foothold in the region. Further, Russia has made extensive territorial claims outside of its exclusive economic zones, trying to poise itself to control the trade routes, such as the Northern Sea Route. Thus, as Russia begins to threaten the stability of the region, it's time for the US to get in the game and restore the tenets of peace that stood so strong for decades. So to do so, let's first look on the state level and more militarily. As our adversaries have bolstered their own military presences in the Arctic, setting themselves up for success, the US must not be left out, especially with the valuable economic resources. So an investment into an Arctic military in training and equipment will certainly enable the US to jump back into the game and deter enemies, while even incentivizing some cooperation. In fact, the augmented and visible deployment of US forces and Arctic-specific equipment, such as icebreakers in the region, can act as a signaling mechanism to potential adversaries. This military presence may convey a preparedness to credibly safeguard our interests, securing the US a seat at the negotiating table as a credible Arctic power. Further, this conspicuous US military presence could compel adversaries, particularly Russia, to adopt a cooperative stance instead of a confrontational one, given that if they are confrontational, escalation risks jeopardizing access to the necessary Arctic resources. Conflict with the West is probably unfavorable for Russia, so the US just needs to send a signal that we're ready. Further, Russia likely does not have the resources to engage in a conflict or an arms race, especially now with the US, given the war in Ukraine showing no signs of nearing its end, which ultimately all points to cooperation as its only option if the US has a bolstered military presence. And cooperation amongst great powers is really feasible and has been seen before. When China sought to establish itself as a near-Arctic power, Russia saw it as an unwelcome push for internationalization and distrusted China's claims. However, in the Arctic, Russia and China still cooperated on projects like hydrocarbon extraction and port building. And now, although Russia and China are certainly more friendly to one another than the US is to either of them, their cooperation emphasizes the feasibility in working with those we distrust. Perhaps what was at play was a kind of keep your friends close and keep your enemies closer dynamic. But the second way is more on the non-state level, and specifically with science. As a common and apolitical language, science brings allies and adversaries together with technology and innovation to address cross-border challenges. That's why historically, scientific efforts and scientific diplomacy have been quite effective in facilitating an easing of tensions and cooperation. During the Cold War, the environment became a battleground for political and ideological competition between the US and the USSR. The concerns of non-aligned nations and indigenous communities led to significant shifts in Arctic environmental policies, encouraging cooperation between previously hostile superpowers. This led to key agreements like the Nixon-Brezhnev Agreement on Cooperation in Environmental Protection in 1972 and the 1973 Polar Bear Conservation Agreement. Scientific collaboration became a trust-building factor, even during high political tensions, paving the way for broader diplomatic engagement. And another great example from the Cold War is the European Monitoring and Evaluation Program, or EMEP, which was a Norwegian proposal which led to the creation of an air pollution monitoring network that helped build trust and cooperation. And on the opposite side of the world, we had Antarctica, with the Antarctic Treaty signed in 1959, which also inspired other treaties, such as the Outer Space Treaty and the Seabed Treaty. So if the US spearheads and coordinates scientific diplomatic efforts, it can facilitate trust and ease tensions, ultimately allowing cooperation to perhaps reemerge as strong as it was under Arctic exceptionalism. So even as the Arctic witnesses these dramatic shifts, if we go with this two-pronged approach, really, with a militarization and some diplomatic efforts, we can try to restore Arctic exceptionalism, both on the state and the non-state level.
Wonderful. What a great presentation. We do have one question in the chat, so I'll go ahead and ask. And just as a reminder, if anyone else has questions, please feel free to type them into the chat. But Alex, Sarah asked, how do we balance climate action and helping to reverse climate change with economic progress, specific to these Arctic regions?
Mhm. So I think especially the first thing that comes to like my mind is the idea of like rare earth minerals, right? That's pretty key in creating a lot of our technologies today, like from the computers that I'm on, like with semiconductors and things like that, but also for solar panels and windmills. All of the technologies today are made from these rare earth minerals in the first place. And given that the United States doesn't have its own domestic supply, rather a lot of them are getting imported from Taiwan or from China, if we continue in like expansion in the Arctic or have some form of cooperation with other actors in the region, it allows us to extract resources that help us fight, I guess, climate change like in the long term. And then with that idea of cooperation as well, if we're cooperating with our NATO allies and trying to get Russia and China into the loop, we can solve for, I guess, broader climate progress because we're cooperating with everybody.
Great. Thank you so much.